The morning after Christmas Vespers had been conducted with the usual blend of chilly piety and modest enthusiasm, the town of Fallowbridge awoke to a rumour so soft-spoken that most residents felt obliged to pretend they had not heard it. The disappearance of Sister Mildred, long considered one of the more dependable ornaments of the parish, was mentioned first by Mr. Cramley, the verger, whose sense of solemnity had always exceeded his capacity for practical insight. He reported the matter not as an emergency but as a notable irregularity, a term he delivered with the mournful pride of one who rarely had an opportunity to use it. Inspector Purbright received the call with the detached politeness of a man who suspected the day had been waiting to find some inconvenience for him. He arrived at St. Gertrude's within the hour, walking across frost-stiffened gravel that cracked underfoot like faintly disapproving applause. The convent buildings, low and habitually shadowed, gave no impression that a nun might have vanished from them with any degree of spectacle. In fact, the stillness seemed anxious to prove that nothing whatsoever could ever be out of place in such reputable surroundings. The Mother Superior welcomed Purbright with a manner that suggested cordiality had been ironed flat by long discipline. Her smile, though technically present, resembled a footnote to a far more cheerful expression that had been edited out. "Inspector, I'm afraid we may have inconvenienced you unnecessarily," she began, as if Sister Mildred's absence had been a clerical misplacement, an item temporarily removed from circulation. Purbright offered a gentle incline of the head. "I trust the matter is minor. Perhaps Sister Mildred is merely delayed in returning from some duty?" "That is certainly one of several wholly reasonable possibilities," the Mother Superior replied, though her eyes shifted toward the chapel with something between vexation and apprehension. "We are, of course, taking care not to let imaginations run immoderately." It was a peculiar reassurance, particularly as no one had accused any imagination of doing exercise of any kind. Purbright allowed the silence to fill the corridor, observing the novices who passed by with expressions carefully emptied of interest. Their glances flickered toward him like moths resisting a lamp. "Mr. Cramley mentioned she was present at Vespers?" Purbright inquired. "Yes," the Mother Superior said, clasping her hands. "She was seated in her usual place. It was only afterward that we noticed her absence. She had not returned to her cell. The chaplain, a mild man whose posture suggested lifelong uncertainty about the reach of his own elbows, joined them then. He affirmed the details with the weary confidence of someone expecting his statements to be doubted on principle. "I'm sure there is a practical explanation," he added, which had the exact opposite effect on everyone listening. Purbright suggested a brief look at Mildred's cell. They ascended a narrow staircase that smelled faintly of lavender and the kind of paper used for devotional pamphlets. The cell itself was immaculate, an orderliness so complete it seemed offensive. A prayer book lay open on the small desk, its ribbon marker slightly askew as if disturbed in haste. The Mother Superior noticed it at the same moment. She adjusted it with quick fingers, restoring the page to symmetrical innocence. "Sister Mildred was always tidy," she murmured, perhaps hoping the statement might carry implications of irreproachability as well. Purbright examined the room with a patient gaze. "She left no note, no indication she intended to be away?" "None," said the Mother Superior. "She was not one for indulgent communication." He detected, beneath the formal phrasing, the faintest irritation. An admission, perhaps, that Mildred's virtues were not universally viewed as such. Downstairs, the convent staff congregated with the kind of self-conscious calm that suggested strong internal competition between curiosity and propriety. The cook emerged from the kitchen with a tray of plain tea biscuits and a determination not to meet the inspector's eye. The gardener, leaning on his broom, greeted Purbright with a nod, so slow it might have been mistaken for a medical condition. "I wonder," Purbright said lightly, "whether anyone noticed Sister Mildred leaving the chapel?" The gardener cleared his throat. "Can't say I did. But then I wasn't looking for anyone leaving who shouldn't be leaving, if you follow." He said this as if it were an extremely clever distinction. One of the novices, a small figure with spectacles that magnified her apprehension, spoke up unexpectedly. "I thought I saw her walking toward the vestry after the service, but it may have been someone else. I sometimes confuse the backs of people's heads." The Mother Superior gave her a look that resembled an overcast afternoon. "Thank you, Sister Agnes. I am sure Inspector Purbright will be able to clarify matters without speculative recollections." Purbright, however, noted it. People rarely volunteered confusion unless they feared remembering too much. Before leaving, Purbright visited the vestry. On a side table lay several sheets of music for the Christmas program. One appeared missing from the sequence. When he asked about it, the choirmaster, summoned with visible reluctance, declared the absence entirely routine. His tone held the crisp defensiveness of someone profoundly relieved to have been asked no further questions. Purbright stepped out into the cold again, the convent doors closing behind him with a softness that felt deliberate. The frost had thickened, sharpening the churchyard into crisp geometry. Nothing overtly amiss, nothing overtly helpful, and yet he felt the first faint tug of misalignment, something gently resisting the official version of calm. A disappearance, he reflected, was rarely as neat as those who reported it would prefer. And Sister Mildred, wherever she had gone, had left behind a room too tidy, a choir sheet too absent, and a community much too eager to behave as though nothing at all had happened. The inspector paused, his breath clouding faintly in the winter air, and considered the chapel windows. One light remained on. It had no reason to be. Inspector Purbright arrived at the parish hall shortly after 9, greeted by the faint aroma of boiled tea and polished wood, an olfactory suggestion that the inhabitants had prepared themselves for a scrutiny they could barely name. The Mother Superior, still impeccably composed, welcomed him with the cautious civility of a hostess, unsure whether her guest sought solace or scandal. "Inspector, thank you for returning. We hope your visit will be neither burdensome nor intrusive," she said, her voice immaculate, yet frayed at the edges of rehearsed warmth. Purbright inclined his head with minimal acknowledgement. "I trust we may proceed with a few questions of convenience?" "Certainly," she replied, leading him into a small room lined with hymnals and pamphlets. The room was clean to the point of aggression, as if dirt were a moral failing. Novices hovered near the doorway, their movements precise but not casual, betraying the slightest uncertainty that one might overstep the bounds of propriety. The first interview was with Mrs. Hayward, a parishioner whose nose for social nuance exceeded her discretion. She had been assigned the informal duty of observing the choir during Vespers, and now found herself under the inspector's subtle scrutiny. I saw Sister Mildred earlier, yes, but I cannot recall precisely where," she began, pausing to fold her hands with the exact angle of a public servant on ceremonial duty. She seemed as usual, quite devoted." Purbright nodded, encouraging nothing more than the truth could be gently extracted. "And later? Did anyone notice her leaving the chapel or moving about the parish?" Mrs. Hayward tilted her head, considering. "Well, there may have been moments when she was not in view, but you understand the service itself. One cannot observe every motion without seeming intrusive." She smiled with the kind of civility that suggested she might, in fact, have seen more than she cared to admit. Next was Mr. Penrose, the editor of the parish newsletter, who had been responsible for recording the Christmas festivities. His spectacles reflected the winter light as he adjusted them and coughed delicately. "Sister Mildred contributed several notes for the bulletin," he said, emphasizing contributed, as if to shield himself from responsibility. "Though I did edit some passages for clarity. Nothing important, really." "Nothing important?" Purbright repeated, his tone mild but insistent. "Merely the usual elaborations," Penrose replied. "She has a tendency to be thorough, excessive perhaps, but nothing untoward." He tapped the ledger in front of him with an air of casual finality, as though closing a subject could preclude any future misinterpretation. Purbright's attention shifted to the curate, a man whose posture suggested lifelong subservience to both canon law and social expectation. "Did you observe Sister Mildred after the service?" Purbright asked. The curate's eyes lowered, then rose again, carefully gauging the inspector's patience. I believe she may have spoken briefly to the choir director. Beyond that, I cannot be certain of her whereabouts. She is, meticulous, and one cannot presume to track her constantly." "Of course," Purbright replied, noting that the curate's reluctance was faintly excessive. There was a subtle tension, almost imperceptible, in the way he clasped his hands and shifted his weight. The choir director, summoned reluctantly, admitted to a minor dispute over pageant arrangements. Sister Mildred objected to the allocation of certain solos, he said, voice neutral but precise. I believe she felt slighted, though I did not perceive it as serious. Purbright observed the careful construction of civility around what may have been an entirely ordinary grievance. In this parish, every disagreement bore the weight of propriety. Even minor irritations were wrapped in a velvet of politeness. During a pause in questioning, Sister Agnes, the novice with spectacles, offered a tentative recollection. "I think she might have intended to speak with Mr. Penrose about the bulletin, though I cannot be certain." Her careful phrasing suggested fear of overcommitment to the truth. Purbright noted it. People rarely volunteered uncertainty without first weighing the consequences of certainty. Mildred's disappearance, it seemed, had activated a subtle network of reputational anxiety that stretched beyond the convent walls. When the interviews concluded, Purbright wandered briefly among the parish papers left open on the tables. A half-completed note, written in Mildred's neat hand, had been folded and abandoned. It referenced observations that might unsettle the usual order without specifying whose order or what observations. The Mother Superior noticed him examining the note and interjected smoothly, "Inspector, I assure you, it is likely nothing of consequence. Minor reflections on matters we have already discussed." Her tone carried an unspoken tension that belied the surface calm. Purbright closed the notebook with care, pocketing the detail for later consideration. Outside, the frost had begun to soften in weak sunlight, though the air retained the sharpness of deliberate caution. As he walked back toward the convent gates, he sensed a subtle shift, a half-perceived dissonance in the otherwise impeccable sequence of civility. Someone, he thought, had seen more than they were prepared to acknowledge. And while no overt sign of disorder had yet emerged, the quietly orchestrated evasions and the careful layering of polite denial suggested that Mildred's absence might illuminate more than her mere physical whereabouts. Purbright paused at the gate, allowing his gaze to linger on the slightly crooked line of the chapel windows. One of them, faintly reflective in the morning light, appeared to guard a secret that no amount of courtesy could fully conceal. He did not yet know its significance, but the seed of suspicion had been planted, quietly, politely, and with the precise timing of one accustomed to waiting for discretion to falter. The morning sun cast a tentative glow over Fallow Bridge, illuminating the neat facades of the parish houses with an almost conspiratorial cheer. Inspector Purbright arrived at the home of Mrs. Linton, an elderly resident whose acquaintance with Sister Mildred had always been more formal than intimate. The front room, decorated with lace curtains and a collection of carefully aligned bric-a-brac, gave the impression of a life devoted to routine and the minimization of embarrassment. Mrs. Linton, seated with hands folded, greeted him with an air of severe civility, as though even the act of shaking hands might compromise propriety. "I understand you wish to speak about Sister Mildred?" she asked, voice cautious but not unfriendly. "Yes," Purbright replied, settling into the chair opposite her. "I am trying to clarify the sequence of her activities yesterday." Mrs. Linton nodded slowly. "I received a letter from her not long ago. Oh, several letters, in fact. She was very meticulous in her correspondence, always the same phrasing repeated carefully. She tilted her head as though this repetition might somehow absolve her of providing useful information." "Were the letters recent?" Purbright inquired, noting the precise lack of dates. "Oh, not the last week," she said, selecting words with deliberate care. "Perhaps the week before. She had matters she wished to see resolved quietly, you understand. It is her way." Purbright allowed a pause to settle, observing her careful attention to formality rather than substance. People rarely volunteered extraneous clarity unless they feared the implication of admitting ignorance. "The content of the letters, did it concern the parish or her personal duties?" he asked. Mrs. Linton frowned slightly, eyes narrowing with polite concern. "Mostly parish matters, though she sometimes included gentle commentary on what she found irregular. Always phrased delicately, of course. One must not scandalize one's neighbors unnecessarily." The inspector made a mental note. "And who else might have seen these letters?" "Only myself," she said, leaning back. "I would never share her words without her permission, though perhaps she wished them shared with those who could implement guidance." Her phrasing implied more than it stated. After thanking Mrs. Linton, Purbright walked to the garden, where the gardener, Mr. Wilkes, was raking frost-stiffened leaves. The man's expression was carefully neutral, but a flicker in his eyes betrayed faint apprehension. "Inspector," he said, setting aside the rake, "I didn't see Sister Mildred leave yesterday, though I did notice her inspecting the flower beds in the early morning. She seemed preoccupied. Perhaps the frost had upset the roses." Purbright noted the ambiguity. The mention of frost, so inconsequential, served only to conceal something more deliberate. "Did anyone else see her at that time?" he asked. "No," said Wilkes, "though Mrs. Pevensey mentioned she thought Mildred was in the garden, but you know how elderly people perceptions differ." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile meant to assure innocence while suggesting that prudence required silence. From the garden, Purbright proceeded to the parish hall, where the town council had convened a small gathering under the guise of reviewing seasonal expenditures. The conversation, ostensibly about hymn books and candles, exhibited a curious rigidity. Every remark was immediately qualified, corrected or softened, as though even minor points of contention could disrupt communal harmony. A council member, Mr. Dalloway, mentioned in passing that Sister Mildred had observed a discrepancy in one ledger. His tone was apologetic, almost rehearsed. "It was trivial," he said, though the very insistence suggested otherwise. I assured her it would be corrected quietly. No one need be troubled. Purbright's attention lingered on the phrasing. People who emphasized triviality often did so to mask embarrassment, and embarrassment frequently concealed something more tangible. Later, the inspector returned to the convent, where he met Sister Agnes again. She hesitated, adjusting her spectacles as if the lenses might shield her from committing indiscretion. I saw Sister Mildred speak with Mr. Penrose yesterday, she said, but I cannot be certain of the content. She appeared concerned about the bulletin, though she did not mention specifics. And did anyone observe her after this conversation? Purbright asked. Sister Agnes shook her head, clearly aware of the gravity implicit in such an observation. I did not, though I cannot claim to have watched her continuously. Purbright paused, noting the repeated pattern. Precise, careful accounts of uncertainty, layered with hints of something being withheld. People did not volunteer such caveats without purpose. He examined the half-open vestry door and noticed a hymn sheet slightly displaced from its orderly row. Its absence was minor, almost imperceptible, yet in this parish even minor deviations seemed significant. He filed the details silently, aware that small physical traces often revealed more than words. As he left, Purbright surveyed the convent from the year-frosted path. The choir-room windows reflected sunlight at odd angles, the panes catching glints that might easily be overlooked. Something subtle, almost imperceptible, tugged at his attention. A shift in light, or perhaps a shift in the habitual rhythms of observation he had come to trust. He knew, with the quiet certainty of patient reasoning, that Sister Mildred's disappearance was beginning to echo through the careful choreography of propriety and polite denials. One small misalignment left unaddressed might unravel more than anyone anticipated, and in that faint glint upon the window, Purbright suspected a trace of intentional concealment, a silent question he would have to answer before the day concluded. The convent's interior seemed to absorb the morning light with a peculiar insistence on order, its corridors polished to a dull sheen and scenting the air faintly of wax and lavender. Inspector Purbright moved slowly along the central passage, noting the disciplined alignment of prayer mats and hymnals, each seemingly positioned to preclude improvisation or disobedience. The Mother Superior appeared at the head of the hallway with her customary composure, though the faint tension beneath her smile suggested a carefully controlled irritation. "Inspector," she said, inclining her head, "I trust your inquiries have not caused undue concern among the parishioners?" "Merely curiosity," Purbright replied, the word neutral but precise, though curiosity can, on occasion, reveal minor misalignments. She offered a faint nod and led him into the common room, a space meticulously arranged for discussion, yet evidently designed to minimize disclosure. Several novices were present, each seated with hands folded as if they were awaiting permission to breathe. Their expressions were delicately neutral, betraying neither alarm nor disinterest, though Purbright noted subtle signs of suppressed scrutiny in their glances. "I should mention," the Mother Superior began, "that Sister Mildred has had certain difficulties of late." Her tone was careful, phrasing deliberately vague. "But I assure you nothing of consequence has occurred." Purbright inclined his head, registering the implication that the convent's internal equilibrium had been subtly disturbed. "Difficulties?" he prompted lightly. She waved a hand, implying that the question bordered on impropriety. "Disagreements? Minor disputes over procedure and decorum? She is, as you know, exceptionally conscientious. Occasionally that can result in friction." He observed her closely. People who took pains to minimize significance often emphasized the gravity they sought to conceal. A ledger rested on a nearby table, its pages open to reveal a series of neatly penned entries. Purbright's gaze lingered on several erasures, small but precise, each appearing to remove a previous record. "These corrections, routine?" he asked. "Entirely," the mother, Superior replied, though the slightest hesitation flickered across her countenance. Nothing irregular, merely adjustments for clarity. Purbright filed the details silently, aware that such erasures often indicated attempts to reconcile competing obligations, truth and reputation in delicate balance. One novice, a timid figure with spectacles that magnified her careful attention, ventured a comment. Sister Mildred expressed concern about the schedule for Vespers. She wished to ensure every detail conformed to tradition. I believe she spoke to the choir director. She paused, eyes dropping. But I cannot be certain of the outcome. The Mother Superior gave her a look that suggested both approval and a subtle warning against elaboration. Purbright noticed how novices were trained to navigate the narrow channel between honesty and discretion, a skill of remarkable subtlety. From the doorway, the gardener, Mr. Wilkes, observed the proceedings with polite distance. His posture was straight, broom in hand, and he offered a nod when acknowledged, yet the precise timing of the gesture suggested calculation. "I believe she spent some time in the herb garden before Vespers," he said quietly. "Perhaps she found the winter chill stimulating, or perhaps not." Purbright noted the uncertainty. People rarely emphasized ambiguity without cause, and in this environment, ambiguity could be a shield for disquieting knowledge. A small envelope rested on the side table, addressed to Sister Mildred, but uncollected. Its presence was mundane, yet in the convent's rigid order, it seemed deliberate. The Mother Superior quickly reached for it. "An old note," she explained, though her fingers lingered for a fraction longer than necessity required, as if asserting control over information that might escape her. Purbright allowed the gesture to pass without comment, noting only the careful choreography of propriety. In this place, every movement and hesitation bore meaning beyond its apparent function. "Have you observed any unusual behavior among the novices or staff?" he asked gently. "Unusual?" she repeated, her voice even but taut. "Only the natural nervousness that accompanies scrutiny. They are diligent, if occasionally over-anxious. I trust that will suffice." Purbright made a mental note of the precise phrasing. Over-anxious diligence often masked minor transgressions or hidden knowledge. Before departing, he inspected Sister Mildred's workspace, noting the neat alignment of paper and ink. A single manuscript page, partially folded and tucked beneath a hymn book, bore penciled annotations in a hand, meticulous enough to suggest both caution and urgency. He allowed himself a moment's reflection, aware that such details, small and easily overlooked, frequently carried disproportionate significance. As Purbright stepped into the courtyard, the frost glinted faintly along the stone path, emphasizing the convent's geometric regularity. The chapel windows caught the morning light at a subtle angle, one pane slightly smudged, a trivial flaw, yet enough to attract attention in a place devoted to symmetry. He paused, sensing the quiet tension that threaded through both structure and habit, realizing that Sister Mildred's absence had created more than physical vacancy. It had revealed the fragile undercurrents of control, propriety, and latent disagreement that permeated the convent. A soft movement in a second-story window caught his eye, a shadow briefly misaligned with the expected patterns of the morning. Purbright noted it without comment, understanding that the small irregularities often held the key to larger truths. As he left, the convent receded behind him in a careful stillness, its polished corridors and precise gardens masking the subtle disturbances beneath. The puzzle, he reflected, was beginning to take shape in hints, shadows, and over-careful gestures. And somewhere in that meticulous world, Sister Mildred's intentions, or perhaps her observations, remained just beyond clear view. The parish committee convened in the council room with all the decorum of a ceremonial chess match. Chairs were arranged with deliberate precision, papers were stacked in careful towers, and the tea urn steamed gently, as if to suggest that civility alone could prevent discord. Inspector Purbright arrived quietly, greeted by a chorus of measured nods and whispers that hinted at both apprehension and curiosity. No one seemed willing to commit more than the bare minimum of acknowledgement. Mr. Dalloway, chairman of the committee, opened proceedings with his usual phrase, "Let us endeavour to maintain clarity and decorum in the face of trivial complications." The last words seemed less reassurance than a preemptive instruction for self-censorship. Purbright observed as members shuffled their notes, glanced at one another with subtle unease, and adjusted collars or spectacles as though these small actions might shield them from inadvertent disclosure. The room exuded polite tension, each participant acutely aware that impropriety need not be overt to be scandalous. "Concerning the Christmas bulletin," Dalloway continued, "it has come to my attention that certain references to Sister Mildred's absence might require reconsideration." He spoke carefully, as if the words themselves might bend reality towards scandal. Several members nodded, each with an expression of faint disapproval, tempered by relief that they were not, as yet, implicated personally. A younger member, Mr. Pritchard, ventured cautiously, "I would suggest we omit mention of her entirely, sir, to prevent unnecessary speculation." His voice was polite, even meek, but Purbright noted the timidity masking a keen calculation. Avoiding acknowledgement could be seen as prudence, but it could also be interpreted as collusion. Mrs. Hayward, who had already been observed as particularly sensitive to social nuance, interjected softly, "Omission may invite rumour. Perhaps a neutral statement would suffice, noting that Sister Mildred was otherwise engaged without elaboration." Her phrasing was measured, yet Purbright detected a subtle tension in her voice, the kind born of anxiety over hidden proprieties. Dalloway considered this, tapping a pencil against the table with deliberate slowness. "Indeed, clarity is essential, though discretion must not be sacrificed. We are guardians of both truth and reputation, and neither may suffer unduly." The paradoxical council drew faint murmurs of agreement, though it was unclear whether these signified understanding or mere acknowledgement of the prescribed formality. Purbright allowed a moment for the room to settle, observing the small gestures that spoke volumes, a finger drumming lightly on paper, a notebook opened and closed with excessive care, a hand lingering too long over a cup of tea. Each act suggested a mind at work, calculating the boundaries of acceptable speech. One member, Mr. Finch, adjusted his spectacles and said, "I should mention that Sister Mildred expressed concern regarding the allocation of certain charitable funds. Perhaps this may have contributed to her present absence." His choice of words, "may have contributed," indicated careful avoidance of accusation while hinting at potential culpability. A brief silence followed, filled with the subtle rustle of paper and the faint sigh of restrained acknowledgement. Purbright noted the room's collective discomfort. In a community devoted to propriety, even the mildest suggestion of impropriety could create tremors of unease. Dalloway resumed, voice clipped with formal gravity. "Let us focus on resolutions. Statements to the parish must be composed with circumspection. Perhaps an emphasis on communal well-being rather than specific incidents would be prudent." He looked toward Purbright, as if inviting him to validate or temper the suggestion. Purbright's eyes roved over the assembled members. "It is often the case," he said measuredly, "that what is omitted may be as telling as what is stated. Prudence is advisable, but clarity is rarely harmful when carefully expressed." His words were neutral in tone, yet the room stiffened perceptibly. Subtle tensions rippled through the committee, each member reassessing the bounds of permissible disclosure. Mrs. Hayward returned to her papers with a faintly apprehensive expression, muttering something about maintaining civic decorum while ensuring that nothing remained unspoken. Mr. Pritchard adjusted his tie, glanced at a ledger, and then returned his attention to the chairman with an expression suggesting calculation and mild alarm. The discussion moved to procedural matters, the arrangement of hymn pages, distribution of refreshments, and scheduling of post-service visits, each item treated with exaggerated solemnity. Purbright noted the meticulous attention to minor detail, recognizing it as a familiar mechanism to deflect attention from less innocuous concerns. As the meeting drew to a close, Dalloway folded his hands and spoke with careful finality. "I trust we have acted with proper regard for propriety and mutual respect. Any unresolved questions may be addressed in due course, though I hope none arise." He allowed a brief pause, permitting the weight of his words to settle. Purbright rose, moving toward the door, but paused at a slight, almost imperceptible gesture. Mr. Finch's hand brushed lightly over a folded sheet of paper, an action otherwise inconsequential, yet oddly deliberate. The inspector's gaze lingered. In a room devoted to measured speech and cautious postures, small gestures often carried the essence of hidden truths. Outside, the winter light softened the rigid lines of the parish hall. Purbright considered the committee's careful choreography, noting the pervasive anxiety beneath their polite veneers. Sister Mildred's absence had not merely created practical complications, it had exposed subtle fissures of propriety, latent resentments, and the quiet orchestration of reputational preservation. And in the small, deliberate gesture of a hand over a folded paper, Purbright sensed a faint but promising clue, a minor silent act that might unravel more than any formal statement could. Inspector Purbright's next visit led him to the modest parish office, where letters, notices, and circulars were arranged with disciplined neatness. The clerk, Miss Fenton, a woman whose politeness seemed almost architectural in its precision, received him with a measured incline of the head. "Inspector, I trust your inquiries continue without undue complication," she said, her voice smooth, though a faint tremor suggested the strain of containing information. "I hope to clarify a few points regarding correspondence," Purbright replied, keeping tone neutral, almost conversational. "Specifically, letters addressed to or from Sister Mildred." Miss Fenton nodded, glancing at the neatly stacked pigeonholes behind her. "Certainly, she was meticulous in her communications, every note accounted for, yet there were a few pieces which did not reach their intended recipients immediately." She emphasized immediately with a careful inflection. Purbright allowed a moment's pause. People who emphasized timing often suggested its significance exceeded apparent importance. "Which pieces?" he asked softly. She gestured to a small cabinet of bound envelopes. One was intended for Mr. Penrose, regarding the bulletin. Another was addressed to the parish treasurer. Both were delayed for reasons that are difficult to elucidate without implying negligence. Purbright's gaze lingered. Delay, however slight, could be a subtle instrument of influence. "Did anyone handle these letters besides yourself?" Miss Fenton hesitated, a fraction too long, before answering. "Only in routine processing, though, well, one cannot always control who glances at incoming items, especially during busy periods." She spoke carefully, as if apologizing for the very possibility of human curiosity. "Of course," Purbright replied, noting the slight tension in her posture. In a place where propriety was paramount, even minor lapses in secrecy could weigh heavily on conscience. He examined the envelopes more closely. The handwriting on the covers was unmistakably Mildred's, neat, deliberate, and imbued with a faintly corrective tone. One envelope, slightly thicker than the others, appeared to contain a folded manuscript rather than a simple note. Purbright slipped it carefully from the pile, sensing the faint vibration of hidden intent. Miss Fenton adjusted her spectacles, observing with a civility that veiled subtle concern. "Inspector, I must caution against overemphasis on what is routine." Sister Mildred often combined matters of personal observation with her administrative notes. There is no scandal here, merely thoroughness. Purbright offered a slow nod, placing the envelope on the desk for inspection. Even routine thoroughness, he reflected, could illuminate small irregularities when viewed in sequence. After reviewing the papers, he departed the office and made his way to the parish hall once more, where a small group of parishioners had gathered for a planning meeting. Their conversation, nominally about the upcoming spring fete, exhibited the same careful choreography of civility he had observed previously. Every suggestion was softened, every objection qualified, as though the very act of direct opinion might constitute social misdemeanor. Mrs. Hayward, always alert to nuanced, mentioned in passing that Sister Mildred had commented on discrepancies in the seating arrangements for choir members. She feared some would feel slighted, Mrs. Hayward said, voice carefully even, though I assured her all was managed according to protocol. Purbright's attention was drawn to the particularity of her reassurance. Those who emphasized fairness often sought to preclude suspicion of imbalance, an implicit acknowledgement that imbalance, however minor, could exist. Later he encountered Mr. Penrose in the bulletin room. The editor was adjusting the typeface of a notice, a habitual gesture suggesting both pride and defensiveness. "Inspector, about Sister Mildred," Penrose began, then hesitated, as if weighing the propriety of disclosure. She had concerns over phrasing and emphasis, nothing contentious, merely a desire for correctness, yet I felt her insistence might have been overcautious. Purbright noted the careful moderation. Overcaution in one person frequently provoked discreet tension elsewhere, a pattern that might explain Mildred's recent absences and subtle friction within the parish. Returning briefly to the convent, he spoke with Sister Agnes, who had grown incrementally more comfortable with disclosure, though her phrasing remained hedged with circumspection. "She intended to write a memorandum," Agnes said, adjusting her spectacles, "to address matters of procedure and observation. She wished it to be considered carefully by those in responsibility. I believe she left it unfinished." The inspector allowed the statement to rest. People rarely emphasized careful consideration, without implying that some consequences might otherwise follow. As the day drew on, Purbright revisited the small garden path behind the convent. Frost glinted faintly along the edges, emphasizing every geometric precision. He paused at the herb beds, noting a recently disturbed clump of soil. Minor, almost trivial, yet consistent with previous observations of Mildred's attentiveness to detail and movement. He reflected on the letters, the manuscripts, and the careful social choreography he had observed throughout the morning. Sister Mildred's absence had catalyzed a quiet unrest, manifesting in small delays, over-emphatic reassurances, and a subtle but widespread preoccupation with propriety. And in the half-folded manuscript from the office, tucked beneath the envelope's seal, Purbright glimpsed a faint notation, a remark in Mildred's precise hand that suggested intention, observation, and perhaps the beginnings of an explanation. The letters, he realized, were more than administrative. They were the faint tracings of influence, anticipation, and carefully managed scrutiny. As he left the garden, the convent receded behind him in measured silence. The shadows cast by the late afternoon sun hinted at hidden alignments, faint irregularities in the rhythm of daily order. In the quiet gestures of clerks, parishioners and novices, Purbright sensed a network of observation and reticence, each layer concealing more than it revealed. One small detail, a slightly smudged envelope, a displaced manuscript page, suggested the first tangible hint of Mildred's unseen actions. Nothing yet explicit, yet sufficient to awaken suspicion in a man attuned to subtlety and nuance. The morning choir rehearsal proceeded with the appearance of serene diligence, yet Inspector Purbright immediately perceived a tension threading through the singers' precise movements. Hymnals were aligned, chairs spaced with ritual exactitude, and voices rose in unison, yet beneath the surface harmony lay micro-adjustments. Eyes flicking toward the director, hands hesitating over music stands, lips pursed to restrain inadvertent intonation. Purbright noted the paradoxical choreography, perfect in form, yet suggestive of internal caution. The choir director, Mr. Hadley, approached Purbright with a polite nod, his spectacles reflecting the winter light streaming through tall windows. "Inspector, we are merely ensuring that all arrangements conform to established standards," he said, voice careful, as if misstatement might compromise the collective composure. "Though I am aware of Sister Mildred's concerns regarding the allocation of solos." "Concerns?" Purbright repeated, letting the word linger. "Minor, I assure you," Hadley replied, though the quick tightening of his jaw betrayed faint unease. She felt certain voices were overlooked. I attempted to address her comments diplomatically. She left a note suggesting alternative arrangements, but I cannot say the matter was resolved to her satisfaction. Purbright's attention lingered on the phrasing. Attempted to address diplomatically often signalled an unresolved tension that had yet to surface publicly. He observed the choir members, each adopting an expression of polite detachment. Mrs. Finch, seated near the organ, kept her hands neatly folded atop the hymnal, yet her fingers tapped faintly against the leather, a subtle punctuation of suppressed concern. Another chorister, a young man with a slight stammer in speech, avoided eye contact entirely, as if acknowledging the inspector's presence might disrupt his self-imposed equilibrium. "Has Sister Mildred spoken with you regarding the sequence of pieces for the service?" Purbright asked quietly. Hadley hesitated, as though the question required consideration beyond the immediate. She made suggestions, always couched in precise terms, emphasis on fairness, on adherence to tradition. Yet I detected an undercurrent of insistence, though I cannot claim to have interpreted her intentions fully. A minor discord emerged from the altos, imperceptible to all but the most attentive ear. Hadley frowned, raising a hand in discreet correction, and the notes aligned once more. The brief disruption, while trivial musically, seemed metaphorically resonant, an almost imperceptible reflection of Mildred's absence. Purbright's gaze drifted to the music stand where Sister Mildred's handwritten corrections rested. The annotations were exacting, precise markings, marginal notes, and careful underlining, suggesting both diligence and quiet assertiveness. Even in her absence, her influence maintained a palpable presence over the assembly. After rehearsal, Purbright requested a brief conversation with Mrs. Finch, who lingered near the organ with evident reluctance. "I noticed Sister Mildred reviewed the music several times yesterday," she said, voice subdued yet deliberate. She was concerned that the emphasis on certain verses might suggest favoritism. I attempted to reassure her, though she seemed unconvinced. "And did anyone else witness this?" Purbright inquired. "Only Mr. Hadley, I believe, but one never truly knows what may be perceived." Her careful phrasing suggested that perception, in this environment, carried the weight of potential repercussion. Purbright allowed the statement to rest. Choir members, parish staff, and even the director navigated a subtle lattice of expectation, propriety, and self-preservation. Every word, gesture, or hesitation formed part of an intricate social calculus. He lingered over the annotated sheet again, noting a faint smudge in the margin beside a note on timing. Minor, almost trivial, yet in a person as meticulous as Mildred, it suggested a moment of haste, distraction, or possibly deliberate concealment. The incongruity, though slight, was enough to pique curiosity. Later, as he moved toward the vestry to examine the storage of hymnals, Purbright noticed a small envelope protruding from beneath the bench. Unsealed, it contained a brief note in Mildred's neat hand, a reminder to adjust the order of verses to prevent perceived inequity among singers. The instruction, simple in appearance, carried an undercurrent of authority that spoke to her concern for both fairness and perception. Purbright replaced the envelope carefully, reflecting on the cumulative effect of these small disruptions. Sister Mildred's absence had rippled through the choir, manifesting in tiny hesitations, adjusted gestures, and heightened attentiveness to perceived breaches of propriety. The evidence was subtle, intellectual rather than physical, yet potent in its implications. He left the choir room with a final glance at the music stands. The slight smudge, the marginal notes, and the careful choreography of the singers all pointed to a single observation. Mildred's influence lingered beyond her presence, and those under her purview were acutely aware of it. Outside, the afternoon sun cast elongated shadows across the parish yard. The choir's harmonies, rehearsed and disciplined, seemed to echo faintly through the cold air, a reminder of the persistent but unseen force guiding them. Purbright sensed a convergence of small signs, each contributing to a quiet narrative of observation, influence, and social tension. One minor gesture, a chorister's finger brushing lightly against a margin note as he turned the page, caught his attention. The action was trivial, almost accidental, yet in this environment of measured propriety, such gestures often conveyed the residue of knowledge, anticipation, or subtle concealment. Purbright noted it silently, recognizing the significance not in the overt content, but in the delicate signals woven throughout the parish's structured life. Sister Mildred's absence had revealed more than her physical whereabouts. It had illuminated the delicate lattice of hierarchy, caution, and conscience that governed even minor rituals. And in that slight movement of a finger across an annotated page, Purbright perceived a faint but promising lead, a subtle, almost imperceptible clue that suggested Mildred's quiet agency continued to shape the unfolding circumstances. Inspector Purbright entered the vestry with measured attention, noting the solemn quiet that hung between the polished pews and the lined shelves of liturgical books. The room carried the faint scent of old parchment and beeswax, and even the air seemed constrained by the habitual restraint of ritual. Two parishioners, Mr. Langley and Miss Porter, lingered near a side table, ostensibly arranging hymnals, yet their movements bore the faint tension of conscious observation. "Inspector," Langley said, inclining his head, "we were merely adjusting the order of volumes. Nothing of import, I assure you." His words, precise and polite, suggested careful self-monitoring, a suppression of details he evidently believed might escape propriety. Purbright allowed a short pause before speaking. "And yet I observe that some volumes are slightly misaligned." He gestured to the table where a small gap between hymnals betrayed the slightest disruption of order. Miss Porter flushed faintly, eyes lowered. "It was merely an oversight," she murmured, the explanation formal yet revealing a subtle discomfort with the inspector's scrutiny. "We intended to correct it immediately." "Of course," Purbright replied, noting the overemphasis on immediacy. People often exaggerated the trivial to conceal the slightly more consequential. He turned his attention to the room's broader arrangement, liturgical schedules posted with fastidious regularity, service registers stacked in neat towers, yet a faint disturbance at the corner suggested a recent intervention, small and deliberate. "Have either of you observed Sister Mildred recently?" he inquired. His tone was neutral, almost conversational, designed to encourage candour without suggesting reproach. Langley exchanged a subtle glance with Miss Porter. "She was engaged elsewhere," he said, then added quickly, "I cannot recall precisely where. The morning passed quickly, and one does not always observe the comings and goings of others." His words were carefully measured, yet the hesitation suggested more than forgetfulness. Purbright noted the phrasing. Engaged elsewhere carried ambiguity, allowing avoidance while hinting at unseen activity. He filed the detail mentally, aware that such deliberate vagueness was often more instructive than overt confession. He moved toward the side table, gently lifting a hymn sheet that had been partially displaced. Beneath it lay a folded note, neatly penned in Sister Mildred's meticulous hand. The message, brief and understated, referenced a minor adjustment to the vestry schedule. A seemingly trivial point, yet the precision suggested her continuing influence over routines even in absence. "Do you know why this note was placed here?" he asked, careful not to imply judgment. Miss Porter shifted uneasily. "She'd wished for certain duties to be clarified. I merely ensured the note remained visible for those responsible. There was no ulterior motive." Her phrasing, while literal, betrayed the faintest tremor of over-explanation. Langley nodded as if in agreement, though his eyes lingered on the note longer than propriety required. The inspector observed their combined reluctance to assert anything beyond formal obligation, a subtle manifestation of the weight Mildred's conscientiousness imposed. Purbright allowed a moment's pause, letting the room settle. The silence itself seemed communicative, each minor sound, the scratch of pen on paper, the careful adjustment of hymnals, resonating as a faint echo of social tension. "Has anyone else entered the vestry this morning?" he asked. "Only routine visitors," Langley replied cautiously. "I cannot claim certainty for the entire morning, but no one of particular note, certainly." The careful hedging suggested an awareness that some observations might be interpreted improperly if disclosed. Purbright nodded, making a mental note. In a parish where propriety governed both speech and gesture, uncertainty itself often indicated more than knowledge. He examined the vestry door, noting a slight scratch on the polished wood, subtle, easily overlooked, yet inconsistent with ordinary movement. No one mentioned it, but in a place where every mark and displacement was observed, it was significant. He filed it alongside the minor misalignment of hymnals and the folded note, recognizing the pattern of subtle irregularities. As he turned to leave, Purbright's attention was drawn to a whisper, a low, indistinct murmur between Langley and Porter, careful not to carry beyond earshot. It was almost imperceptible, yet in its restraint lay intention, the faintest acknowledgement of knowledge or concern left unspoken. He stepped back, allowing a second glance at the vestry. The hymnals, registers, and notes seemed ordinary, yet together they formed a lattice of influence, observation, and expectation. Sister Mildred's absence had cast a gentle shadow over routine, exposing latent conscientiousness and concealed anxiety among those under her oversight. Outside, the morning light slanted across the churchyard, illuminating frost on the stone paths and accentuating the geometric precision of the garden. The vestry remained behind him, calm yet subtly charged, a repository of minor disturbances that collectively suggested an underlying narrative of vigilance and propriety. One small gesture, the careful repositioning of the folded note by Miss Porter, caught Purbright's eye. It was trivial, almost accidental, yet in the context of the vestry's rigid routines, it hinted at both respect and apprehension. He noted it silently, recognizing that the smallest action could reveal hidden attentions and intentions. As he walked away, the inspector considered the vestry's quiet signals, misaligned hymnals, subtle marks, folded messages, whispered communications. Each was minor, yet together they formed a faint but discernible thread, a subtle pattern of influence and observation that might illuminate Sister Mildred's whereabouts and intentions. In that small, almost imperceptible gesture of careful adjustment, Purbright discerned the first tangible trace of purposeful action, a clue, delicate and unassuming, yet promising in its potential to unravel the quiet mystery surrounding the convent's internal rhythm. The late afternoon sun slanted across the parish hall windows as Inspector Purbright arrived, greeted by the faint murmur of voices and the rustle of papers. Parishioners were assembling for the weekly committee review, a gathering ostensibly devoted to practical matters, though Purbright recognized the undercurrent of social observation that underlay every interaction. Chairs were positioned with deliberate spacing, notebooks opened and closed with careful timing, and a shared consciousness of propriety seemed to govern even the smallest gesture. "Inspector," Mr. Dalloway greeted him with a precise nod. "We were just reviewing the distribution of last Sunday's announcements. I trust the inquiry has proceeded with due circumspection." "Entirely," Purbright replied, noting the subtle tension behind the polished exterior. "Though minor irregularities may provide insight." Dalloway's expression flickered briefly, a nuance almost imperceptible to an untrained eye, before settling into habitual composure. "Of course," he said, his tone formal, but carrying the faintest suggestion of guarded concern. Purbright observed the parishioners seated around the table. Each bore the air of genteel attentiveness, yet subtle signs of unease revealed themselves in flicked eyes, adjusted spectacles, and the occasional twitch of a hand brushing papers. In a community so attentive to reputation, small deviations from routine became disproportionately significant. "Concerning Sister Mildred," Dalloway continued, "there have been inquiries regarding her recent absence. Some parishioners appear uncertain how to address the matter." His phrasing emphasized collective responsibility, a strategy that both distributed potential discomfort and masked individual uncertainty. A younger member, Miss Cartwright, spoke softly. "I have received notes from the congregation expressing curiosity, though phrased as concern for proper order. None wish to imply criticism, yet they hope her duties are proceeding satisfactorily." Her careful balance of civility and inquiry suggested she had observed social tension firsthand, yet sought to remain unobtrusive. Purbright nodded slowly. Concern for propriety, even when expressed indirectly, often revealed more about perception than intention. He allowed a pause to let the room's subtle rhythms unfold. A cough, a cleared throat, the quiet repositioning of hands. Each minor act contributed to a lattice of observation and inference. "Do we know if Sister Mildred communicated any particular requests before her absence?" he asked, keeping tone neutral. "Only routine notes," Dalloway replied, though phrased with precision. "She emphasized fairness in all matters of duty. Beyond that, there is nothing notable." He offered a polite smile, though Purbright detected the faint tension in the corners of his eyes. The inspector allowed his gaze to wander across the table. A stack of circulars rested nearby, each carefully ordered yet slightly askew, suggesting recent handling. Small details, Purbright reflected, often held disproportionate significance in a parish attentive to ritual and expectation. Mrs. Hayward, seated with impeccable posture, adjusted her spectacles before speaking. "There is one minor matter," she said. "A discrepancy in seating arrangements for the choir during Vespers. Sister Mildred had remarked upon it previously, and I believe she intended a formal note, though it was never completed. Her careful diction implied deference and subtle concern, revealing anxiety over both oversight and potential misinterpretation. Purbright filed this observation silently. Minor procedural details, when magnified by conscience and social expectation, often catalyzed disproportionate ripple effects. Mr. Penrose, who had remained quiet, cleared his throat. "There is the question of commentary in the parish bulletin. Some phrasing suggested emphasis on certain contributors over others. Sister Mildred wished adjustments, but the final copy did not fully reflect her notes." He paused, lowering his gaze, a gesture conveying both politeness and apprehension. The inspector noted the triangulation of small tensions, absent influence, procedural precision, and the ever-present vigilance of reputation. Each minor disruption, delayed notes, overlooked seating, unincorporated commentary, reflected not chaos, but a careful dance around propriety and latent concern. Purbright allowed himself a slow survey of the room, fingers tapping lightly on table edges, a faint exhalation of collective uncertainty, eyes shifting subtly to gauge reactions. All these gestures spoke more loudly than any overt statement. He moved toward the window where light highlighted the faint frost lining the garden path. Small smudges on the sill suggested recent intervention, inconsequential in themselves, yet consistent with patterns he had observed elsewhere. Meticulous attention, minor adjustments, and an unspoken network of influence left by Sister Mildred. As the meeting drew to its close, Purbright observed a fleeting exchange. Miss Cartwright slid a folded note across the table toward Dalloway, who adjusted it with deliberate care before returning it to his ledger. The gesture was brief, almost imperceptible, yet in a room governed by exacting propriety, it carried the weight of silent communication, a signal, a subtle clue, a trace of unseen oversight. Stepping into the corridor, Purbright reflected on the day's observations. Sister Mildred's absence had not merely created logistical gaps. It had exposed the delicate lattice of conscience, reputation, and oversight that bound the parish. The minor disturbances, gestures, and delayed communications were fragments of a hidden narrative, each awaiting careful interpretation. A faint noise. From the hallway, a paper shifted, a door moved slightly ajar, caught his attention. He paused, noting the imperceptible irregularity. In a place governed by routine and decorum, such a gesture, however small, might signify purpose, anticipation, or concealed knowledge. Purbright allowed himself a measured smile, inwardly acknowledging the subtlety of the clues before him. The trail, faint and almost intangible, was nonetheless discernible to one attuned to observation, discretion, and the gentle unrest beneath the parish's polished surface. Inspector Purbright returned to the parish on a crisp morning, the light filtering through frost-lined windows with a gentle insistence. The convent, quiet and orderly, exuded its usual aura of restrained attention, yet today the inspector noted a subtle shift. The parishioners, staff, and committee members seemed less taut, though still measured in comportment. Small gestures of acknowledgement, hats adjusted, spectacles polished, papers aligned, carried an air of preparation, as if propriety itself had been sharpened by observation. He was met by Mr. Dalloway, who inclined his head with customary formality. "Inspector, your continued diligence honours us," he said, the words carefully chosen to convey courtesy without unnecessary familiarity. "I trust your inquiries proceed without disruption?" "Merely observation," Purbright replied, glancing briefly at the neatly arranged chairs and registers. "I am interested in understanding the subtleties that govern parish life." His tone, neutral yet exacting, seemed to draw attention to the understated patterns that had governed previous encounters. Inside the vestry, the air smelled faintly of wax polish and aging books. Miss Fenton moved to retrieve documents, her gestures precise, deliberate, and unconsciously cautious. Even routine actions appeared imbued with a consciousness of scrutiny, a hallmark of communities devoted to both order and observation. "Inspector," she said, placing a small bundle of papers before him. "These are notes from Sister Mildred, compiled during her absence. She requested they be reviewed once the parish had resumed its usual rhythm." The phrasing emphasized propriety and deferential care, as though even the method of delivery required ceremony. Purbright examined the notes, recognizing immediately the meticulous organization, minor corrections to hymnals, suggestions for committee procedures, and gentle observations on interpersonal tensions. None were dramatic, yet each hinted at Mildred's subtle orchestration of propriety and expectation. He observed the committee gathered around the table: Dalloway, Mrs. Hayward, Mr. Penrose, and Miss Cartwright. Their expressions were carefully neutral, yet the occasional flicker of curiosity or apprehension betrayed awareness of his scrutiny. "Inspector," Dalloway began, voice measured, "perhaps we should consider these notes in relation to recent events. Sister Mildred's absence has clarified certain procedural oversights, has it not?" His phrasing invited reflection while avoiding accusation, allowing discretion to dominate interpretation. Purbright allowed a measured nod. "Indeed, minor adjustments often reveal the structures of attention and influence. The manner in which they are addressed can illuminate latent tensions, concealed priorities, and individual conscience." Mrs. Hayward adjusted her spectacles, lips pursed, in faint acknowledgement. "I suppose her guidance is most apparent in small acts, the placement of hymnals, timing of announcements, allocation of seating. Each is trivial alone, yet collectively significant." "Yes," Purbright said softly, observing the almost imperceptible glances exchanged among committee members. Subtle intervention frequently exerts more enduring influence than overt action. Absence, when managed thoughtfully, can catalyze reflection and reveal hidden hierarchies. Mr. Penrose, ever cautious in his speech, added, "Her notes also clarify intentions that might otherwise be misinterpreted. What could be perceived as negligence or oversight is, in fact, conscientious direction." He tapped the stack of bulletins lightly, signaling the delicacy of the distinction. Purbright allowed silence to settle over the group, giving weight to the layered significance of small gestures. A slightly displaced sheet, a fold in a manuscript, a pause before response. Each acted as both mirror and messenger, signaling perception and interpretation within the careful lattice of parish life. He then turned to the final note, one written in slightly smudged ink, a minor irregularity amidst otherwise pristine precision. The message referenced a rearrangement of tasks, concluding with an understated remark about communal attentiveness and fairness. A faint smile touched his lips. In a community of restraint and expectation, such a small notation carried authority and subtle foresight. Outside, the winter light caught on the frost-laden paths, illuminating the geometric precision of hedges and flower beds. Purbright paused, considering the cumulative weight of minor observations, gestures, and delayed communications. Sister Mildred's absence had created a quiet tremor through the parish, revealing latent conscientiousness, hidden anxieties, and the imperceptible channels of influence she maintained. A minor movement caught his attention. Miss Cartwright, without apparent deliberation, slid a folded note toward Dalloway, who adjusted it slightly before tucking it under his ledger. The gesture was fleeting, almost accidental, yet in a society governed by propriety, it suggested both acknowledgement and the continuation of Mildred's influence. Purbright allowed himself a subtle nod. The clues, dispersed and delicate, were less about scandal and more about perception, signals of observation, conscience, and silent orchestration. The parish's social lattice, so attentive to propriety, now revealed itself as a living network of subtle guidance and measured restraint. He left the convent quietly, the churchyard stretching before him in crisp, ordered tranquillity. Small shadows and light shifts mirrored the subtle alignments he had observed, minor disturbances, deliberate gestures, and small acts of conscience that, when taken together, illuminated the previously unseen forces at play. In that gentle lattice of oversight, anticipation, and moral vigilance, Purbright perceived the quiet resolution of the mystery. Absence had revealed influence, propriety had illuminated intention, and even the smallest gesture, a note shifted, a page marked, could serve as a key to understanding the parish's intricate equilibrium. The faint smudge on the final note remained, an almost imperceptible signature of Mildred's presence and intention, inviting reflection, subtle inquiry, and a recognition that the most enduring mysteries often reside not in dramatic events, but in the quietly observed, carefully measured acts of ordinary lives.